You have important vocabulary this week. We are going to be looking more at food chains and food webs, and so we definitely need to know what a food chain is. This is the transfer of energy from the sun to the producers to the consumers. We also need to know what a food web is. That's easy. That is a group of overlapping food chains. And so when you have more than one food chain, you've created a web. And that's the way it occurs in nature. You don't have just a straight chain in nature because animals, organisms eat more than one thing. We need, of course, to know what an organism is. That is any living thing. That includes your plants, your bacteria, your animals. Anything that is alive is considered an organism. In our food webs, we need to understand what producers are. Oops, need to spell that correctly. These are organisms that can produce their own food within their body. These are your plants and some green algae. These are things that can take in sunlight and water and carbon dioxide and produce sugars within their own system. That's not us. So when you think producer, think plants. We need to know what consumers are. And I know that you've heard these in previous videos, but I just want to make sure that you have a good, clear list of vocabulary. Consumers are anything that must take in food for energy. That would be all of your animals and us. We need to understand what primary consumers are. Primary consumers are the organisms, the animals that eat plants. These are your herbivores. Herbivores are your animals that eat only plants. It can also include your omnivores. Omnivores are animals that eat both plants and meat. And so an omnivore can be a primary consumer when they are eating plants. We need to understand what secondary consumers are. These are the organisms, the animals, that eat the primary consumers. These are your carnivores. Carnivores are meat eaters. It can also include your omnivores when they are eating meat. We have a third category called tertiary consumers. These are also carnivores and omnivores, and they are the consumers in the food line, in your food chain, that eat the secondary consumers. So you have the plant, you have the animal that eats the plant, that's the primary. Then you have the animal that eats that primary consumer, such as the snake that might eat the rabbit. And then you have the tertiary consumers, such as the hawk that eats the snake, that eats the rabbit, that eats the grass. We also have predators, and I know you're familiar with predators. These are your hunters, the ones that hunt prey for food. These will be your carnivores. We have prey. These are the hunted animals. Let's look at a forest food web. We see here, and let me shrink this picture just a little bit so that we can see everything. We see all of the energy that drives this entire food web comes from the sun, our solar energy. The energy transfers from the sun to the plants. This includes your grass, your flowers, your trees, any producer. and we need to make sure we understand our plants are our producers. I know we've already reviewed this, but this is a question you really need to understand. The arrows point to who is eating. So who is getting the energy from these plants? We see the insects, we see the herbivores, we see omnivores. Notice that those chipmunks are eating the plants as well as the insects, so they're an omnivore. The skunks are omnivores. They are eating the plants as well as the toads and the insects and the mice. They are definitely an omnivore like us. We see some carnivores. If you notice, these owls are hunters, so they are considered a predator. They may be a secondary consumer. They may be a tertiary, depending on where they are in line. If you notice, they could be considered a secondary when they are eating the chipmunks, because it goes from the plants to the chipmunk to the owl. They could also be considered a tertiary, because if we look here, from the plants to the insects to the mice would be secondary, and then to the owl would be tertiary. So it depends where in line and what they are eating at the time. So we do have predators, we have some prey. Can you find prey in this food web? Definitely your chipmunks, your mice, your toads. Not only can they be a predator in the line because they are eating the insects, they can be prey of other organisms such as the snakes and the skunks and the owls. Notice we have fungus over here, fungi. Those are your decomposers. They break down dead plants and animals. That is another vocabulary word that we need to know is decomposer. We talked about that in the class. And let's go to a new slide and write that word. Decomposers are organisms that break down dead animals, plants, and waste. This returns nutrients to the soil. Another word that you might see is the word population. When we talk about a population, that just means the number of a specific organism in an area at a given time. So if we were to look at this picture here, we would have a population of skunks. It's the number of skunks that live in an area at a given time. We don't count the skunks from 100 years ago or 10 years ago. We're looking at how many skunks live in that area at the time you're counting. That's called a population. Let's talk about decomposers and scavengers. Both of these are part of the food web. Our decomposers, remember, are organisms that break down dead plants, dead animals, and waste from other animals. When these decomposers, like the mushroom or the earthworm, the bacteria, or even, I call them a roly-poly, they're a pill bug, when they start to eat dead matter, it breaks down, it goes back into the soil as nutrients that can be taken by the plants. Scavengers, on the other hand, we see different types of vultures, scavenger birds, hyenas, and other animals that eat dead animals. And we see carcasses there. We talked about that word in class. A carcass is just a dead body that they're eating on. These scavengers will eat dead things. They don't hunt it down and kill it. They find things that are dead and eat it. But then they produce a waste that can then be broken down by the decomposers. That's the difference. Let's remember that the food web starts with the energy from the sun. That solar energy is taken in by the producers, our plants, that then goes to the primary consumers, on to the secondary consumers, and even the tertiary consumers. We can see those denoted here by your plants. The arrows travel from the plants to those primary consumers, on to secondary consumers, and even to tertiary consumers. If in this picture the snake were eaten by this hawk, the hawk would be a tertiary consumer. All of the arrows eventually point down to the decomposers because when these plants and animals die, they will be broken down by the bacteria, the fungus, other decomposers, in return to simple compounds that are in the soil. These are good nutrients for the plants. Also, be thinking about for class time what happens when we remove something from the food web. Let's say that we take out all of the oak trees, which gets rid of all of the acorns. What might happen to the mouse? This is something we're going to investigate in class next week, so be sure you're thinking about what happens if a population increases or decreases or even disappears.